welcome back to my channel. It has been a long old time since I filmed a sit down chatty video like this. But if you are new to my channel, hi, my name is Molly and I am currently living and traveling in Australia with my boyfriend, and we have just got back from doing a road trip across Australia's west coast. So we had always had this plan. Ever since we came to Australia, we knew we wanted to do the east and the west. Like, we weren't just coming to stay on the east coast. Basically, if you haven't watched the vlogs, we spent the last month pretty much living in a camper van and traveling all over. We started in Perth and then we traveled down to Australia's southwest, so Esperance and Albany, and then we drove back north and headed all the way up to Exmouth, inland to Karajini, and then back down again to Perth. And I wanted to do a breakdown in this video of exactly how much that cost, because honestly I think I would have found it really useful beforehand. I want to say now, this isn't a cheap trip. As soon as you consider hiring a van for a month, the cost is high. Like, this was probably one of the most expensive travel trips that we've ever done. I also just want to note that Tom and I spent the 4 months before this working in Melbourne, saving up some money, and also we're both in a very lucky position where we work digitally and we were working the whole time that we were on the west coast as well. So that's a little bit of a disclaimer, but I'm not here to be like, oh well, like this is quite a lot of money, or like this isn't a lot of money, because this is just a fact video. Like, I'm just here to tell you what we spent, and we did it so thoroughly, guys. Like, we downloaded an app called Wanderlog. This is not sponsored at all, but if you're doing a trip like this, I think it's really useful. You can input absolutely everything you spend in different categories. So we've got like fuel, food, activities, accommodation. All of that is literally broken down within the app. So during this video, I'm going to talk about everything in Australian dollars, because we spent absolutely everything in Australian dollars, but I will make sure that the conversion is on screen. I also can't tell if I'm just out of focus or if it's my eyes. What is the camera doing? No, I was out of focus. So the main expense and the biggest outgoing obviously was the van, which we rented from Travellers Autobarn, and this cost us $3,397, which is this in pounds. Now that's a lot of money, I'm very aware of it, but similarly that was the cheapest that we could find it. We shopped around for various different vans, and this was like the absolute basic as well. Like, this van was not kitted out with very much. It was basically a bed and a van, and that was it. Like, there wasn't even a fridge. It did have a kitchenette, and it did also obviously have like electricity when we plugged it in and stuff. Like, it was marginally better than if we'd hired a car, but if you hired a big car, it wouldn't have been that different. Yeah, I mean, I think we got our money's worth out of it. Obviously, I do think that it's a lot of money, but when you also consider that it is your accommodation mostly, you know. Separate to that, I'm just gonna go through like category by category rather than like each individual day. I'm not going to be like, on the 23rd we spent this in Woolworths. That was the cost of the rental. Then our next biggest expense was actually activities, and we spent $1,680 on activities, and again, that's quite a lot of money. The main bulk of that was on the whale shark swim. So we paid to go swimming with whale sharks. Again, we booked this as cheap as we possibly could, and we actually did get a discount because I booked it through Get Your Guide and I did use my own link. Shameless, but like, why would you not? So this was what that cost in British pounds. Again, if you shop around online, you can't really find it any cheaper than that. Like, we browsed the internet, guys. We didn't just dive headfirst and book everything the second we saw it, because we knew this was gonna add up. Other activities though included quad biking, a snorkeling day trip, a couple of museums that were like $20 each. I think we spent $40 going to the cinema. So like, there was just a couple of odd bits and bobs, and obviously this was over the course of the 25 days. I'm so sorry about the crane right outside the window, it's so loud. Okay, the next most expensive thing, which I'm actually surprised this isn't second, was petrol, guys. Oh my life. Wow. So in total, we actually drove 7,000 kilometers, just over. In miles, I think that worked out at like 4,300 miles. To give that some perspective, I worked it out. If you were to set off from central London and drive an actual road route for 4,300 miles, you would be in Dubai. Like, you'd be in the United Arab Emirates. That's how far we drove. So then when I say the cost of the petrol, I think you'll be like, yeah, fair enough. So in total we spent $1,500, or 1,518 if we're gonna be exact. And that is this in pounds. And while this is a lot, I think if you consider what that would cost in the UK, because the cost of petrol here is about like half maybe a little bit more than what it is currently at home. And I think that we were like really using that as a guide and a perspective, because we were like, yeah, this is a lot of money, but it would be so much more if we were filling up a car at home. What I will say is we actually didn't get many miles to the gallon out of the van, so we were filling up a lot. And obviously the van was very heavy as well, because it had like all of our stuff in it. It was probably equivalent to having a car full of like 5 or 6 people. Obviously you're going through fuel more when you're weighed down more. So yeah, that was the cost of petrol. So accommodation, this was a personal choice. We could have saved money here, and I chose personally not to, just because I would have rather have been somewhere that was safe, lit, and also had electricity. We spent $1,252, or this in pounds, on campsites. And while this sounds a lot, you have to consider that that was for, I think, 25 nights of accommodation. And you're probably thinking, but you've paid for the van, why are you paying for accommodation? So true. But every second or third night, you have to stay at a powered campsite so that you can charge the van, so that the engine starts, you know, because if you're charging all your appliances off of the electrics inside, and you know, you're running the lights and you're running the radio, the battery would die. Like, that would be the worst thing ever, because you're in the middle of nowhere. However, we could have alternated between powered sites and non-powered sites. We could have even free camped, and I know that this is how like the proper backpackers do it, and like, you know, the actual van lifers. Personally for me, just because we didn't really know where we were or where we were going to be, and also how safe these places are. Like, if you're just rocking up in a field, anything could happen. Like, somebody could come in the night and smash the window in, and like, I know that that's such a hypothetical fear, but like, you're not as safe as you are in a house. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're a little bit vulnerable, and I felt safer if we were on like campsites. That was a personal preference. Like I say, you absolutely could probably lose about $500, $600 off of this amount, but that was just a choice. I'm not going to justify that too much more, but that was what we spent on all of the different campsites. I think in total we stayed at 13 different locations in 13 different towns. Okay, the next expense was food, and on food we actually only spent $906, which is this in pounds, for 2 people for a month, including, I think we ate in restaurants 5 times. To be honest, I think it's quite good. Like, we did do it on the cheap. We shopped in Aldi where we could. We also weren't eating as much. Like, I'll be really honest, we were probably having 2 meals a day, just because firstly we were driving a lot, and secondly we would just eat a bit later and have breakfast a bit later, and then we were having dinner really early because we were having it in the daylight, and then we were just having snacks in an evening. So we were definitely saving a little bit. On alcohol, the total expense for both of us was $257, which is this in pounds. This is nothing, guys, compared to when we backpacked the East Coast. Like, some people could spend that in like 1 weekend of nights out. I think for a month, we definitely kept the drinking cost so low compared to any other backpacking trip. But again, we were in the van, like, we're driving most days, so that was kind of why. And also because there's a lot less of a social scene when you're in a van. Like, you're not staying in hostels, there's not really anywhere on the West Coast where you're gonna go out drinking, so it's always more like, oh, we'll just drink at the campsite. And because it was only Tom and I, we're not that fussed. Like, I'll have a cider every now and then, or I'd have like a gin and tonic with my dinner, but like, we weren't really drinking, so that kept the cost down. Let's put a section in here, because Tom's done this, by the way, not me, for groceries. I'm not sure if this is like coffees and cafes, or if this is actual groceries, but if it is, then I'm not sure what the food section is. But either way, we'll combine this. So this was the actual total on food, if you include like coffee and cafes and breakfast places. I'm not really too sure why they're separate, so this is an updated amount for food. So the next category is shopping, and basically that is things that we have bought from like stores. So for example, Bunnings, Kmart, anything that we bought for the van that isn't food. So like, for example, we bought a camping light, we bought camping chairs, we bought just a couple of things like that. We spent $71, which is this in pounds. I don't think that's too bad. But yeah, generally we didn't really buy very much because we didn't really need very much. Like, we did do it pretty basic. Like, we didn't even buy a table. We were just cooking on the floor because we were like, well, a table's another $10. We don't really need it. It's only gonna go in the bin at the end of this. It's just waste. So didn't even buy a table. So the next thing is sightseeing, and we spent $60 on that. What this actually was our access into all of the national parks. So here in Western Australia, they have this system where you can go to the national parks. It's very cheap, it's like basically free, but you have to pay an initial entry. So for the month we paid $60, which is this in pounds, and that gave us access to every single national park in Western Australia for a month, which I actually think is really good. Like, it's done per vehicle rather than per person, which I actually way prefer. And the only exception to this was a couple of the national parks aren't included if there's like special activities there. So for example, when we went over to Monkey Maya, which is where we did the dolphin feeding experience, you have to pay for that separately because obviously there's like people working there and it's an event and an activity. It's not just like you're walking around a national park. Which personally I really understand and I think it's really reasonable. Last category is other. This is just miscellaneous things really, like washing. So we paid to use washing machines and tumble dryers a couple of times. We bought pegs to peg stuff out on the washing line, things like that. We spent $19, which is this much in pounds. So as you can see, the further down the list we got, the cheaper it got. And like I say, the big bulk of the expense was the van, the petrol, and the overnight stays. The actual activities, like when you're out and about, a lot of them, once you've got the national park pass especially, they don't cost much extra. Like, you're seeing these like beautiful natural places. You're not really paying for like super intense activities. And I think that that is where it differs from the East Coast, because when you're on the East Coast, quite often in every place you're paying to do things. Like, you're sailing around the Whitsundays, or you're doing a tour on Fraser Island, or you're doing a distillery tour in Byron Bay, and like all of those are additional costs. For the most part, when you get to the location in Western Australia, you've paid for it, like that's already done. There's not more activities other than the times that we did the whale sharks and the snorkeling, and all of that was up towards the very end of the trip. That means that the total expense for this trip was $9,410, which is $4,705 each, which is this in pounds. So this is the breakdown of what this cost. Now, obviously, again, this is a lot of money. I'm very aware that this is more than your average holiday, and I'm not gonna sit and be like, oh, but it's worth it for this and this. Like, we're not justifying it. This was part of the Australia trip that we wanted to do. I will say it's probably similar to what you would spend on the East Coast, maybe actually slightly less. But again, it really depends on how long you're traveling for. Like, the bulk of this was, like I said, the transport and the accommodation. So if you were to drive less far and spend less nights doing this, you would spend less, like, obviously. So I'm gonna also be quite honest here, because we actually have $180 being refunded from Travelers Autobahn for two reasons. I am never one to complain. Tom is somebody that believes that like if something isn't right, it should be fixed. And I probably wouldn't have done this, but I'm glad that we have, because we had a couple of issues with the van, and this wasn't really Travelers Autobahn's fault, but it was something that kind of affected our trip. For example, the heater didn't actually work, so we'd spent like $25. It didn't work. It just went off the whole time. Like, you'd turn it on, it would be on for a minute, it would just die. And I think that on its own wouldn't have been an issue. We wouldn't have mentioned it. We'd have been like, oh, by the way, this didn't work, whatever. But we also had issues with the actual like van. Like, we could not clear the windscreen. The demisting system inside didn't work. The heating and the air conditioning didn't really work either. So like all of the stuff in the front when it was raining, you couldn't clear the windscreen. It was actually really dangerous. Like, we were driving one day, I vlogged it, into Geraldton, and the visibility was so poor that we had to just stop, because we were like, this isn't safe. We can't see the road, we can't see the traffic. Yeah, we just could not. So Tom mentioned it to them and was like, we don't really know what to do about this, blah blah blah. And basically they gave us the equivalent of what it was to rent the van for one day, which is $150, I think, and then the cost of the heater back. I would not have complained about that, but like, I'm glad that Tom did, because also it just highlights to them that there's a few issues that need fixing before the next person rents it, more from a safety perspective. Like, we were not kicking off, we were really polite, we were just like, you know, just letting you know this actually isn't working and blah blah blah. So they were really good about it, and they were like, oh, we'll refund you the last day of your trip. So that means that we have $175, I think it is, coming back. So with that added on, it makes this the total, but obviously that was kind of just lucky or unlucky depending on how you look at it. I will say, I actually think this is one of the first times Tom and I have really budgeted on a trip like this strictly. When we were in Asia, we didn't really budget like this, just because everything in Asia is very affordable. If you want to go out for food and for drinks all the time, you're not spending much. You're spending like £3 or £4. Similarly with the East Coast, when we first got to Australia, we were like, this is like a big trip. Like, you know, we were just really excited to be here. We're spending Christmas here. We weren't budgeting as strictly. We were obviously keeping an eye on everything, but we were kind of like, we've saved money from being at home in the UK, we're coming out here to do this trip, we just want to have a really good time. On this trip, we knew that we only had really the money that we'd saved in Melbourne plus the money we were making on the go, because we didn't want to be spending too much out of savings. Like, the reason we had the jobs in Melbourne, the reason we were working was to like continue traveling, so we were a lot stricter. And even though I do think this is a lot of money, I think it could have been a lot more. Like, we could have been eating out a lot more, we could have been drinking a lot more, we could have booked more activities. There were a couple of things that we chose not to do just because it was more expensive. For example, we didn't swim with manta rays in Coral Bay because we were already going to swim with the whale sharks in Exmouth. And we were like, right, we'll pick one or the other. Where on previous trips, we may have just done both because we were like, well, we're never going to do this again, let's do both. Whereas on this trip we were a little bit stricter. Also, I do think it's part of like van life. I think van life is a little bit like, you're roughing it, you're eating like packet pasta and, you know, Belvita biscuits for breakfast. It's not a luxurious form of traveling. Like I say, the vlogs are already up on my channel. I will link the playlist down below, because I feel like I've really not stressed this enough, but like the driving was a lot. Like, I feel as though if you actually were to do the drive that we did, you'd be like, yeah, I understand why that costs so much in fuel. I am gonna end this video here. I hope you have found it useful. This isn't really me chatting about money because we've spent this much. It's more to help you guys if you're planning a similar trip, and also just to give an insight, even if you're not planning this trip, onto what these sort of things cost. Like, this whole thing was booked through Tom and I. None of it was gifted, none of it was sponsored, nothing like that. It was just us on the road in a van. Do let me know as well if you are planning a West Coast trip, if you want any tips or tricks I can try and advise you. Other than that, I'm gonna go. I shall see you in my next video. If you're interested in shopping on my travel e-guides, which are all now live on my website, the entirety of Asia is complete and live, you can shop that down below. It will be the top link in the description. But other than that, I'm gonna go, and I shall see you very, very soon with a vlog from Kuala Lumpur, which is so exciting because we've been in Australia for like 7 solid months now. There's been no vlogs from anywhere else, so really, really excited to be uploading some Asia content, and hopefully you guys are going to enjoy it. Bye guys.